My father's 70th birthday dinner was held at the most expensive restaurant in the city. All night my sister found small ways to remind everyone I didn't belong there. "Careful," she said loud enough for the table to hear. "One meal here probably costs more than your entire army paycheck." Everyone laughed. I just drank my water and said nothing. Then the restaurant manager walked over personally and bowed his head. "Colonel Madeline Parker, is everything to your satisfaction, ma'am?" The whole room went silent. My sister turned to stare at me. "Why did he call you Colonel?" I smiled because she had only just discovered the smallest part of the truth. I hadn't been home in almost 2 years. 2 years of training rotations of temporary duty assignments that stretched longer than promised, of a small apartment near base that never quite felt lived in because I was rarely there long enough to notice the dust settling. When my mother called to say my father wanted the whole family together for his 70th, I requested leave the same afternoon before I'd even let myself think about what walking back into that dining room would feel like. The restaurant Jennifer chose sat on the top floor of a glass building downtown, all soft lighting and white tablecloths, the kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices because the assumption is you already know you can afford it. I noticed the choice the moment I saw the reservation confirmation Jennifer had forwarded to the family group chat. She hadn't picked it for our father. She'd picked it because she knew exactly which one of her siblings would feel out of place there. Jennifer had always been the daughter my parents introduced first at gatherings, the one whose name came up naturally in conversation with neighbors and old friends. She sold luxury properties along the coast, the kind of houses that appeared in glossy real estate magazines, and she had built an entire identity around being visibly, undeniably successful. She wore it the way other people wear cologne, a little too much applied a little too early in the day, impossible to ignore. I had built something too. It simply didn't come with a title anyone at that table understood or cared to ask about. Growing up there had been an unspoken hierarchy in our house, one nobody stated outright, but everyone somehow knew. Jennifer was the daughter who made sense, bright, social, ambitious in ways my parents recognized and could brag about at church, at family reunions, at holiday parties. I was harder to explain, quieter, more comfortable observing a room than commanding it. When I later chose to enlist, my father had a phrase he liked to repeat at dinners for years afterward, delivered with the particular fondness of a joke that had stopped being funny long before he stopped telling it. "The Army's fine for a few years," he'd say, "but it's not really a career, is it? Not something you build a life on." That night, sitting at the long table with white orchids arranged down the center, Jennifer leaned toward me during a lull in conversation. Her voice pitched just low enough to sound private, while making sure our cousins across the table could still hear every word. "Careful with the wine, Maddie. One glass here probably costs more than what you make in a week." A small ripple of laughter moved around the table. Our mother smiled, the tired, practiced smile of someone used to smoothing over her daughter's friction. Our father didn't look up from his plate at all. I picked up my water glass instead of the wine, took a slow sip, and let my eyes move toward the window, toward the lights of the city stretching out below us. I had learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth fighting at a dinner table. That dignity sometimes looked like silence rather than defense. 22 years in the Army had taught me exactly when to hold a line, and when a line wasn't worth holding at all. This felt like the second kind of moment. Or at least it had, until now. The manager appeared at our table without warning, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who ran his restaurant the way I once ran a command post, aware of everything happening in the room at once. He stopped directly beside my chair, straightened slightly, and bowed his head with a formality that made Jennifer's sentence die halfway out of her mouth. "Colonel Madeline Parker," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the whole table to hear clearly. "Is everything to your satisfaction, ma'am?" For a moment, nobody at the table moved. My mother's fork paused mid-air. My father set down his glass slowly, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in the particular confusion of a man realizing he might not know his own daughter as well as he'd assumed. Jennifer turned toward me fully now, her earlier smugness replaced by something closer to disbelief. "Why did he call you Colonel?" she asked, her voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. I set my water glass down gently, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips, and allowed myself for the first time all evening to smile. Because whatever Jennifer thought she knew about me, about the sister who joined the army because she couldn't do anything else, about the daughter who missed birthdays and holidays, chasing some vague sense of duty, nobody at this table had ever bothered to understand. She had only just discovered the smallest, thinnest edge of the truth. The rest of it she wasn't ready for yet. Long before that dinner, long before the rank on my shoulder meant anything to anyone at that table, there was a version of our family that had already decided what each of us was for. Jennifer was the daughter who made sense. She had been homecoming court, then student council, then the first in her friend group to buy a house before 30. My parents told her story easily, the way you tell a story you've rehearsed so many times it no longer feels like memory, just fact. I was harder to summarize. I read instead of socialized. I asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. I noticed things, the way my father's jaw tightened when bills came due, the way my mother went quiet during arguments instead of raising her voice, and I filed them away instead of talking about them, which people mistook for coldness rather than what it actually was. The September I turned 19. I watched the towers fall on a television in my dorm common room, surrounded by classmates who cried, who called their parents, who tried to make sense of something that refused to make sense. I remember feeling something settle inside me that week, quiet and absolute, a decision forming itself before I'd consciously chosen it. 2 months later, I told my parents I was enlisting. My father's reaction wasn't anger. It was worse, a kind of flat disappointment delivered without raising his voice. "You're smart enough for something better than this, Madeline." My mother cried at the kitchen table, not out of pride, but fear, the particular fear of a parent who has just watched their child choose a path they don't understand and can't protect her from. Jennifer, 22 at the time and already selling her first listings, said the thing that stayed with me longer than either of our parents' reactions. She said it lightly, almost as a joke, the way she said most of her cruelest observations. "People join the army because they don't have better options, Maddie. You could do so much more than that." I signed the paperwork anyway. Basic training broke me down in ways I hadn't expected, and rebuilt me into someone I didn't fully recognize for a while. Someone capable of function under exhaustion, under fear, under conditions where hesitation cost more than mistakes. I made it through Ranger School 2 years later, one of a handful of women in my cohort, earning a tab that meant something enormous inside the Army, and meant absolutely nothing at my parents' dinner table, where it was rarely mentioned at all. The deployments came steadily after that. Long stretches overseas where mail took weeks to arrive and phone calls home were rationed to a few precious minutes at a time. I missed my mother's 60th birthday. I missed 2 consecutive Christmases. I missed my nephew's wedding entirely, sending a gift instead of my presence and absence Jennifer brought up at every family gathering for the following year, always phrased as concern rather than accusation. "It's just sad is all. Family should come first." She never asked what I'd been doing instead. None of them did. What I was doing during those missed holidays was learning how to carry weight nobody at home would ever have to understand. I was learning how to knock on a mother's door in a language not my own and tell her that her son wasn't coming home. I was learning how to keep my hands steady while making decisions that would determine whether other mothers received that same knock. I was learning that duty sometimes meant choosing the needs of 40 soldiers under my command over the comfort of people who loved me, but had never once asked what that cost. Meanwhile, Jennifer's success kept climbing each year, bringing a bigger house, a nicer car, a louder announcement at Thanksgiving about her latest listing or bonus. And each year, almost proportionally, I watched myself shrink smaller in my family's eyes, becoming the daughter people spoke about carefully, apologetically, the one who meant well, but had chosen a hard path and missed so much. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being loved by people who have quietly decided you're a disappointment dressed up as concern, so it never quite looks like judgment. I felt it every holiday I managed to attend, sitting at a table where Jennifer's success was celebrated in specific glowing detail, while my own life was acknowledged only in vague, slightly worried terms. "How's the Army treating you, sweetheart?" as though it were a diagnosis rather than a career. I never corrected them. I never explained the citations, the meaning behind the ribbons I wore. Only at formal functions they never attended the weight of command I carried that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with lives. Explaining felt somehow like begging for something I shouldn't have to beg for their belief that what I did mattered. Sitting in that restaurant on my father's 70th birthday, listening to Jennifer's familiar jab about wine and paychecks, I felt the ghost of every dinner like it before. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every quiet moment where I chose silence over defending a life they'd never bothered to understand. But something about this particular evening felt different beneath my calm. Maybe it was the years finally catching up, or maybe it was simply the exhaustion of being underestimated by people who shared my last name. Whatever it was, some quiet certainty had settled into my chest, hours before the manager ever approached our table. This dinner, I already sensed, was going to be the last one where my family got to decide who I was, without ever really knowing me at all. The silence after the manager's question stretched long enough to feel physical pressing down on the table like something with actual weight. My father set his fork down entirely now, studying me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, not even confusion exactly, but the unsettled look of a man realizing a piece of furniture in his own house had been rearranged without his noticing. "Colonel," my mother repeated softly, testing the word like it belonged to a language she'd only half learned. Jennifer recovered first, the way she always did, reaching for an explanation that would shrink the moment back down to something manageable. "It's probably just a military discount thing," she said, forcing a small laugh. "Restaurants do that sometimes, right? Thank a veteran, offer a free appetizer." She looked around the table for agreement, but nobody offered it back to her. Before I could respond either way, the kitchen doors swung open again, and the head chef himself walked out from the back, still in his white coat, wiping his hands on a towel tucked into his apron string. He didn't look at the manager or wait for introduction. He walked directly to our table, and when he reached me, he didn't extend a hand for a casual restaurant greeting. He came to something close to attention, the posture unmistakable to anyone who had spent real time around service members, and gave a short, respectful nod of the head. "Colonel Parker," he said, "it's an honor to have you in my restaurant tonight." Behind him, a second employee, someone in a dark suit I hadn't noticed near the host stand all evening, approached as well, and did something that finally erased any doubt at the table. He offered a crisp, careful salute, the kind taught and practiced, not performed casually. My family sat in absolute silence. Jennifer's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, no explanation ready this time. I set my napkin down and looked between the two men with the quiet recognition of someone finally understanding a coincidence that wasn't a coincidence at all. "You're Daniel Whitfield's father," I said to the chef, watching something shift in his eyes, relief maybe, or gratitude too large to easily hold. "Staff Sergeant Whitfield." The chef's composure cracked slightly at his son's name, his eyes glassy for just a moment before he blinked it back. "Yes, ma'am. Danny told us everything years ago, about the convoy, about what you did that night." His voice caught slightly. "We never got the chance to thank you properly. I didn't even know you'd be dining here tonight until I saw the reservation name." My father looked between us, his expression unreadable, though something in his shoulders had gone rigid, the posture of a man trying to fit new information into a story he thought he already knew completely. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "What convoy?" I hadn't planned on explaining this here in this restaurant on this particular night. But the question hung there sincere for what felt like the first time in years, and I found myself answering it plainly without the armor I usually wore around my family. "There was an ambush during a supply run about 8 years ago," I said. "Multiple vehicles hit. I made the call to reroute the convoy through terrain we hadn't cleared, which wasn't standard procedure, but staying on the original road would have meant driving directly into a second wave we'd just gotten intelligence on. It was a risk. It worked. We got everyone out, including Danny, who was 19 at the time and had a shrapnel wound in his leg that could have been much worse if we'd been 10 minutes slower." The table stayed quiet. Jennifer, for the first time all evening, had nothing prepared to say. The chef nodded, his eyes still bright. "Danny's married now, 2 kids. He coaches his son's little league team on weekends." His voice wavered slightly. None of that happens without you, Colonel. Please, tonight the meal is on the house. It would be an honor to serve you, ma'am. It's the very least we can do." My father sat back slowly in his chair, and for a long moment he simply looked at me the way you might look at a photograph you'd walked past 1,000 times without ever really seeing it. My mother's hand had risen to cover her mouth, her eyes shining. Though I couldn't yet tell if it was pride or grief for years, she now suspected she'd misunderstood. Jennifer, when she finally spoke, sounded smaller than I could remember her ever sounding. "I didn't know any of that," she said. Not quite an apology. Not yet. "You never asked," I said, not unkindly, just honestly, the way I might state a fact in a briefing. There was no bitterness in it, only 20 years of accumulated truth finally finding daylight. The chef gave a final respectful nod before returning to his kitchen, the young man in the suit following behind him, leaving our table in a silence unlike any I'd experienced with my family, before not tense exactly, but full heavy with things that had gone unsaid for far too long. My father cleared his throat, his voice rougher than usual when he finally spoke. "Madeline," he said, using my full name the way he rarely did anymore. "How many things like that have happened that we don't know about?" I looked at him for a long moment, weighing how much to give him, how much this fragile new opening between us could actually hold. "More than I could tell you in one dinner," I said quietly. "But I could try if you wanted to hear it." For the first time in longer than I could remember, my father nodded without hesitation, without the usual dismissiveness that colored most of our conversations about my service. "I would," he said. "I think it's long past time I did." Beside him, my mother reached for my hand across the white tablecloth, her fingers trembling slightly, and for a moment none of us said anything else at all. The whole table sitting quietly with the sudden overwhelming awareness that there was an entire version of me none of them had ever bothered to meet. The rest of dinner sat differently after that. The waiter cleared plates in careful, quiet movements, as if sensing the table needed space rather than service. Jennifer picked at the last of her dessert without eating much of it, her earlier confidence replaced by something more subdued, something that looked almost like discomfort in her own skin. My father kept glancing at me between bites like a man rereading a sentence he'd misunderstood the first 4 times through. It was my father who finally broke the quiet, setting his coffee cup down with unusual care. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked, not accusatory, genuinely searching. I turned the question over before answering, aware that the easy response, the one that let everyone off the hook including me, would be to say it never came up, that there was never a right moment. But that wasn't entirely true, and I was tired of half-truths at this table. Because for a long time it felt like nobody was actually asking, I said quietly. "Not really. You'd ask how the army was treating me the way you'd ask about weather somewhere far away. Polite, distant, not expecting an actual answer." My mother's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away, so I told them. Not all of it. Some things I still didn't have language for, some things belonged only to the soldiers who'd been there with me, but more than I'd ever offered across a dinner table before. I told them about Private Ortiz, 20 years old, who didn't make it home from a deployment that should have been routine, and how I'd been the one to write the letter to his mother in Texas, choosing each word as carefully as I'd ever chosen anything in my life, knowing no combination of sentences could soften what I was telling her. I told them about the villages we'd evacuated ahead of flooding one rainy season, carrying children who couldn't have been older than my nephew across water that came up to my waist, my radio slung across my back, praying the current didn't take any of us with it. I told them about Master Sergeant Reyes, who I'd served alongside for 6 years, who still called me every Christmas morning no matter which continent either of us happened to be standing on, because family in the army sometimes looked entirely different than the family you were born into. None of it was cinematic. There were no dramatic music swells, no neatly resolved endings. Mostly there was just responsibility carried quietly day after day in places most people back home never had to think about. There was a stretch. I said, my voice steadier than I expected, about 5 weeks during one deployment where communication was down almost entirely. No calls, no emails. I know that's the time you all decided I'd forgotten about the family. Jennifer brought it up for months afterward. Jennifer flinched slightly but didn't interrupt. What you didn't know, I continued, was that during those 5 weeks I was working almost around the clock trying to coordinate safe passage for over 200 people, including children out of an area that was becoming too dangerous to hold. I wasn't ignoring you. I physically couldn't reach a phone most days, and when I finally could, I was so exhausted I could barely remember my own address, let alone find the energy to explain any of this in a 5-minute call home. My mother's hand tightened around mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I really thought—" "I know what you thought," I said gently without blame. That's exactly the point. Jennifer, who had been unusually quiet through most of this, finally spoke, though her voice carried less of its usual polish. "You still make less money than I do," she said. It wasn't cruel this time, not really, more like something automatic, a defense mechanism reaching for familiar ground because she didn't know what else to hold on to. I actually smiled at that, surprising myself with how little heat was behind it. "Maybe," I said simply. "But I never measured what I do by what it pays Jen. I measure it by whether Danny Whitfield gets to coach his son's little league team on Saturday mornings, by whether Ortiz's mother knows her son didn't die alone. That's just a different kind of ledger than the one you're used to." My father sat back, slightly studying his oldest daughter with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not disappointment exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular unease of a parent realizing the values he'd unconsciously modeled for his children might not have been the ones he actually believed in. "I always told people the army wasn't a real career," he said slowly, more to himself than to me. "I think I need to reconsider a lot of things I've said over the years." Nobody responded right away. The restaurant continued quietly around us, other tables, laughing glasses, clinking the ordinary rhythm of a Friday evening, entirely unaware of the reckoning happening at ours. I looked at my father, seeing for the first time in years something honest in his face, instead of the practiced pride he usually reserved for Jennifer's accomplishments. "You don't have to reconsider everything tonight," I said softly. "Just maybe start asking real questions instead of assuming you already know the answers." He nodded slowly, and for the first time all evening, I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not just surprise anymore, but the early, uncomfortable beginnings of genuine doubt about whether he'd truly known his own daughter at all these past 20 years. The birthday dinner ended quietly not long after that conversation, the kind of quiet that comes from a room full of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood. Hugs at the door lasted a beat longer than usual. My father held onto my shoulder an extra moment before letting go, as though searching for something in my face he hadn't bothered to look for in years. I assumed that would be the end of it. One honest evening, a few uncomfortable truths finally spoken aloud, and life would resume its familiar shape soon enough. I didn't expect what came next. It started with a phone call from my mother almost 2 weeks later, her voice hesitant in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Madeline," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I don't want you to be upset." She explained that she'd been going through old files while helping my father organize his home office, and had come across paperwork from a law firm neither of them recognized, dated several years back. Payments, she said, recurring payments toward my father's small business loan, the one he'd taken out years ago to keep his hardware store afloat during a slow stretch, and had quietly struggled to repay ever since. Payments that had, according to the documents, been arriving steadily for almost 6 years. "There's no name on most of it," my mother said, "just a law firm handling things on someone's behalf. But then I found an email confirmation buried in an old folder, and Madeline, it had your name on it." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, feeling something settle in my chest. Not quite guilt, not quite relief, more like the particular discomfort of a private decision suddenly becoming visible. Years earlier, after learning through a cousin that my father's loan payments had fallen behind, I'd arranged with an attorney to handle the remaining balance directly structured in a way that kept my name out of the paperwork my parents would actually see. I hadn't done it for recognition. If anything, I'd done it specifically to avoid the kind of conversation I was now having. I didn't want my father's gratitude tangled up with old resentments about my career choices. I simply wanted the weight off his shoulders quietly without complication. It hadn't stopped there, though. My mother didn't know the rest yet. 2 years after the loan, when my mother needed a surgery, their insurance only partially covered, I'd arranged those payments the same way through the same attorney, careful to keep my name out of it entirely. When my nephew, Jennifer's oldest, had gotten into a state university with a financial aid gap, neither Jennifer nor her husband could close without taking on debt they'd been trying to avoid. I'd quietly covered the difference as well again through the same legal channel again without a single conversation about it. I explained all of this to my mother, slowly watching the words land through the silence on the other end of the line. "Madeline," she finally said, her voice breaking slightly, "why would you do all that and never say anything?" "Because I didn't want it to be about me," I said honestly. I wanted Dad to keep his store without feeling like he owed me something for it. I wanted Ethan to go to college without wondering if his aunt in the army was quietly resentful about paying for it. I just wanted to help. Quietly felt like the right way to do that. My mother was crying by the time we hung up, though she assured me they were the good kind of tears, the kind that come from finally understanding something that had been misunderstood for far too long. Jennifer called 2 days later. Her voice when I answered sounded uncharacteristically unsteady. "I talked to Mom," she said, "and then I called the law firm myself because honestly I didn't believe it at first. I thought maybe it was some kind of misunderstanding." She paused. "It's not a misunderstanding. They confirmed everything. Ethan's tuition gap, the loan, Mom's surgery, all of it." I didn't say anything right away, giving her the space to continue if she needed to. "I spent years telling people you didn't understand real responsibility," Jennifer said quietly. "That you chose some abstract idea of duty over actual family obligations. And this whole time you were quietly carrying obligations none of the rest of us even knew existed." "I wasn't trying to make a point, Jen," I said gently. "I wasn't keeping score waiting for the right moment to reveal it. I genuinely just wanted to help without it becoming something complicated." "I know," she said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I heard something in her voice that wasn't performance, wasn't competition, wasn't the careful positioning she usually brought to every conversation between us. Just plain unguarded honesty. "I think I've spent so long needing to be the successful one that I never stopped to consider what real strength actually looks like." Neither of us said much else after that, the conversation settling into a silence that felt different from all our silences. Before, not tense, not competitive, just two sisters sitting quietly with a truth that had rearranged something fundamental between them. Later that evening, my mother called back one more time, her voice thick with emotion she no longer tried to hide. "I don't know how to say thank you for something you never wanted thanked for," she said softly. I told her she didn't need to, that some things were never meant to be repaid, only understood. But even as I said it, I could hear her crying quietly on the other end of the line, the sound of a mother finally seeing her daughter clearly, perhaps for the very first time in over 20 years. Jennifer showed up at my parents' house unannounced the following weekend while I was there packing a few things before heading back to base. I heard her car in the driveway before I saw her, and something in the rhythm of her footsteps up the front walk told me this wasn't going to be a casual visit. She found me in the guest room folding a uniform shirt into my duffel bag, with the same careful precision I applied to everything else in my life. She stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, and when she did, her voice carried none of its usual polish. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one. Not the kind I've been giving for the past 2 weeks that's mostly just embarrassment dressed up as regret." I set the shirt down and turned to face her, fully waiting. I spent our whole lives needing to be the one everyone was proud of. Jennifer continued, twisting her hands together in a way I'd never seen from her before, not once in 38 years. "And somewhere along the way, I think I decided that meant you had to be the one who wasn't. Like there was only room for one of us to matter in this family, and I made sure it was me." "Jen, let me finish," she said, and I did. "I called you a disappointment to people at parties. I told Ethan his aunt in the army was probably lonely and directionless, that he should feel lucky he wasn't like you. And this whole time, you were the one quietly making sure he could actually afford to go to college." Her voice cracked slightly. "I don't know how to undo 18 years of being cruel to you, Maddie. I don't think an apology fixes that. I sat down on the edge of the bed, giving myself a moment before answering, wanting to be honest rather than simply comforting. You're right that it doesn't fix it, I said finally. But it's still worth saying. I just need you to understand something first. She nodded, waiting. The comments never actually hurt as much as you probably think they did, I said. I built enough armor in the army to handle worse than dinner table jokes. What actually hurt Jen was something quieter than that. I paused, choosing the words carefully. It was going years without anyone in this family asking how I was doing. Not how the army was treating me like it was some job I'd get tired of eventually. Just how I was doing. As a person. Nobody ever asked that. Jennifer's eyes filled, and this time she didn't try to blink it back. I never asked because I think some part of me didn't want to know, she admitted. Because if I actually understood what you were carrying, I couldn't keep telling myself the story where I was the successful one and you were just getting by. Downstairs, I heard my father's footsteps on the stairs, slower than they used to be. And a moment later, he appeared in the doorway beside Jennifer, having clearly heard at least part of the conversation. I want to say something too, he said, his voice rougher than usual. I spent years making jokes about your career being temporary, Madeline. I told myself I was just teasing the way fathers do. But watching you at that restaurant, watching how those men looked at you, how much weight you clearly carried without ever once asking us to acknowledge it. He stopped, gathering himself. I think I was afraid, if I'm honest. Afraid of what it meant that my daughter was doing something so much larger than anything I'd ever done, and I didn't know how to be proud of that without feeling small next to it. I hadn't expected that from him, the admission underneath the years of dismissive comments, the fear dressed up as indifference. Something in my chest loosened slightly, an old tension I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. I'm not asking either of you to make up for years overnight, I said quietly. That's not how this works, but I'd like it if going forward you both actually asked, even when the answer might be harder to hear than you expect. My mother appeared in the doorway now too, having clearly been listening from the hallway, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. She crossed the room without a word and wrapped her arms around me, holding on longer than she had in years, long enough that I felt something in my own chest finally soften completely. I'm sorry, she whispered against my shoulder. For all of it. For every year we let Jennifer's version of success be the only one that counted in this house. Jennifer stood near the door, tears falling freely now, and when I looked at her over our mother's shoulder, she simply nodded, unable to find more words, but no longer needing them to communicate what she meant. That evening, as I finished packing for my flight back to base the next morning, the house felt different than it had in years. Not perfect, not entirely healed, but honest in a way it hadn't been in a very long time. My father knocked lightly on the doorframe just before I turned off the light. Travel safe, Colonel, he said. And for the first time, the title in his mouth didn't sound like a stranger's word borrowed for effect. It sounded like something he meant. 4 months later, my parents flew out to attend a change of command ceremony at the base, where I'd been serving an invitation I extended almost hesitantly, unsure whether they'd actually make the trip or find some reason the timing didn't work. They arrived a full day early instead, and I watched something shift in my father's expression the moment we walked onto the parade field together, and he saw for the first time the scale of what I'd spent over 2 decades building. Rows of soldiers stood in formation beneath a clear autumn sky uniforms, crisp flags moving gently in the wind. My father stood beside my mother in the small section reserved for family, and I noticed him straighten his own posture slightly unconsciously, as though something in the discipline surrounding him demanded it. When my name was called and I stepped forward to formally relinquish command, the adjutant read my full record aloud across the field, deployments, decorations, years of service laid out in the clean, unembellished language the military uses for moments like this. I heard my mother's soft intake of breath somewhere behind me, as the list continued longer than either of my parents had likely expected. I heard more distinctly. My father's voice murmur something to my mother that I couldn't quite make out, though I recognized the tone. Disbelief. Not doubt this time, but its opposite, the disbelief of someone finally seeing clearly what he'd spent years failing to notice. Afterward, soldiers I had commanded for the past 3 years came forward one by one to shake my hand, some embracing me despite the formality of the occasion, murmuring thanks I hadn't expected, and didn't feel I'd fully earned, not compared to what they'd each given. A young captain I'd mentored through her first deployment held my hand a moment longer than necessary. "You made me better than I thought I could be, ma'am," she said quietly. "I hope you know that." My father watched all of this from a short distance, and when the crowd finally thinned enough for him to approach, he didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply looked at me the way you might look at something you'd walked past every day for years without ever truly seeing it. "I spent so long thinking success meant being the loudest person in the room," he finally said. "Watching you today, I don't think that's true at all. I think it means being someone other people trust completely, even when everything is on the line. I don't think I understood the difference until just now." Beside him, my mother reached for my hand, her eyes glistening but her smile steady. "We're proud of you, Madeline," she said. "Not despite the life you chose, because of it." Jennifer, who had also made the trip despite a business trip she'd rearranged to be here, stood slightly apart from our parents, watching the last of the formation dissolve into small clusters of soldiers, greeting their own families. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd heard it in years, stripped of the performance that used to color almost everything she said. "I used to introduce you at parties as my sister who joined the army," she said. Like it was some vague, slightly unfortunate footnote to an otherwise normal family. She paused, watching a group of young soldiers laughing together nearby. "I don't think I'll ever introduce you that way again. I'm proud to call you my sister Maddie. I should have said that a long time ago." I didn't need the apology by then, not really the months since that dinner had already rebuilt something steadier between us than any single sentence could summarize. But hearing it anyway out loud in front of everyone who had once measured our worth so differently settled something in me I hadn't realized was still waiting to be settled. Standing there on that field, watching my parents finally see the shape of a life they'd spent 2 decades misunderstanding, I thought about all the dinners before this one. The quiet jabs, the careful silences, the years of being underestimated by people who loved me but had never quite known how to see me clearly. For years, my family measured success with money. The army taught me to measure it differently, by the lives you lift, the promises you keep, and the people who trust you completely when everything is on the line. That night at the restaurant, my family finally learned why a stranger called me Colonel. But the rank itself was never really the story. Character was. It always had been, quietly all along, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it landed. Have you ever had someone in your own family finally see you clearly after years of being misunderstood? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one waiting to be shared with you, so please subscribe and stay close, because moments like this are exactly what we love bringing you. Thank you for spending this time with Madeline's story. And let's keep walking this journey together.